And Shabbat Shalom. Welcome back to Parshat Truma, Parshat Zachor, the portion of remembering and forgetting. Today is a very important day in the fight against COVID. It was just at Purim last year when we started to become aware of the pandemic in a significant way. And one of the great dividing lines between communities that experienced the first wave and communities that did not were communities that were open or closed on Purim. And our community was closed. It was our first live broadcast of a service without anyone in attendance, and that would have been the Megillah. And we will be broadcasting the Megillah again on Purim, and you could tune in the evening, and the morning information will be available on the website about that, about timing and so on. The Megillah will be read, and there will be a brief introduction for the Megillah, and you'll be able to read along with the text of the Megillah. Now, we were closed, as I said, but others were open. And many of those communities that were open were the ones that had the first wave in a significant way. And this year, in a completely different tone, even the most observant and Orthodox communities have essentially made Purim exclusively within the home. No synagogue gatherings, maybe the reading of the Megillah with small groups, but the feasts and the gift giving, you're allowed to give one gift per family, and it's supposed to be to family members and so on. So that way they hope that here we are a year on and we don't have a repeat of what happened. But also in the greater society, we're finding that now is the time when we're being told that with the variants coming, the next few weeks will decide whether or not we get into a severe third wave or not. And it's worth talking about it, not because we're not all exhausted about COVID and the impending doom and gloom and the inexorable length of this pandemic and the fears over inoculation and so on. But it's worth talking about it because it identifies one of the great human conditions, which is, where is my place? Where do I belong? What is my sanctuary? Today I'm standing in our sanctuary, the synagogue, and it cannot be declared to be a true sanctuary unless there are people in it. It's just walls and voice and camera and TV. But for there to be some sanctity to it, it has to be sanctioned by the people that are in it. It has to be acknowledged. It has to be a place, a destination for sanctuary. And in this week's portion, Parshat Truma, a fascinating thing is about to happen. They've left Egypt. They've started camping in the desert. They're forming a societal structure. They're dividing into groups and tribes and tents and different, basically laying out streets within their encampment. And there was a plan that whenever they would move, they would just simply lay out the grid and everyone would get in lockstep back on the grid quickly. And that way they had law and order. The 10 Commandments had been given. Moses was teaching Torah. All the things we've been talking about. Law and order, societal justice, everything was falling into place. But yet there was no home for the spiritual entity that they acknowledged had given them the freedom and exodus that they enjoyed. And they wanted to honor God. And God says in this week's portion, one of the most important lines you'll come across with regards to sanctuary and synagogue life. It says, "Tell the people of Israel, and they should give me gifts or give gifts, whatever they feel like, whatever their heart, enthuses them to do, that's what they should give." So everyone could participate to whatever level they had capability. And then it says, this is chapter 25 and verse 8, "Let them make me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them." Let them make a sanctuary so I can dwell among them. So I've argued in years past that in order for humanity and God to coexist, God actually has to be in a sanctuary, which keeps us and God separate but together. Because humanity cannot function well with God's presence everywhere. The people that like to slap God on everything, or make everything about God, or make it every action we do for God, to God, fear of God, love of God, it's too much. You need a sanctuary for God. You need a space. We have an ark. The ark contains our imagery of God. How good would your life be if your parents lived in your home and watched everything you did? How comfortable would you feel living, expressing yourself? Imagine if every conversation you had was being listened to. How would you react? Imagine if your life was Truman Show and somebody was watching every single move that you made. How would you feel? Well, when you grow up in a world which is totally God-enamored, everything is about God. God is watching you, God's looking at you, God's with you wherever you go. In the bedroom, in the bathroom, in the sanctuary, and every word, everything is measured, written, inscribed, and there will be punishment and reward later on. That's a life without sanctuary, without God boundaried, without humanity boundaried. And it becomes impossible for people to live in a society where there's no free thought and there's no sacred space in their own head. So God is boundaried by humanity, and humanity therefore can say, there's a place where I connect, and there's a place where I disconnect. Not that God doesn't exist, and not that God doesn't manifest everywhere if that's what you understand it to be, but that humanity has the ability to create a space and a distance so we can box God literally, so we have a space outside. And that's what seems to be happening in the camp, where in order for the people to get on with their lives, they can't always live in this heightened state of the awesome God who destroys Egypt, who comes on the mountain with fire, who gives tablets from heaven. It becomes impossible to live as a person that way. So they have to have a boundaried space. So they choose to make a tabernacle, a mishkan, a place, a resting place. People will argue that's because they wanted to bring God in, and I'm arguing that's because they need to keep God in a space that they can identify as spiritual, secular, holy, mundane. Humanity needs to divide the two. You cannot have them intermingle to the point at which there's no distinction, because then you end up literally living with a camera on you all the time, and it becomes impossible to be real. So that's the thing we've talked about in years past, and now I want to talk about the definition of sanctuary. I want to talk about vishachanti, what it means to dwell. What does bitocham mean, amongst them? And what does it mean mikdash? What does sanctuary mean? And I won't go into too much depth, but you could extrapolate for yourself what we're referring to. What is typically referred to as mikdash is the Beit HaMikdash, the sacred home. That would have been the temple. But now, modern days, sanctuary in a synagogue is a temple. But a home is also a mikdash, is also a sanctuary. Your family is the metaphoric sanctuary. If you're lucky, you have a place to go. You have open hearts and open minds and people who love you. That is in itself a sanctuary. Of course, people talk about nature being a sanctuary. You talk about travel. People talk about their hobbies, running, cycling. All these things become sanctuaries for people where they can disconnect from the ordinary and be transported into something beyond the mundane. That is really the reference to sanctuary. And then if you're truly lucky in life, you get to have a holy of holies, a sanctuary within a sanctuary, and that is where you get to things like love and purpose and goals and fulfillment. That is where not everybody gets to go there. Many people in life suffer because they have no sanctuary within their sanctuary. And to be truly, truly fulfilled, that is what people pursue. If you have love, if you have deep love, if you have long love, if you have meaningful love, unconditional love, that is a form of sanctuary within sanctuary. If you have a job and you have fulfillment, that's sanctuary within sanctuary. But not everybody has it, and it's something to pursue, and it's worthwhile giving up other things in life to try to achieve that. And then what does it mean to dwell? Vishachanti. Vishachanti, and I will dwell amongst you. or I can dwell amongst you. It's about compromise, about creating space for others so that you have space for yourself. If you take up all the space in the room, well, you have nobody else in there. Then you can't complain that there's nobody there to give you sanctuary because you haven't made room for them. This is the idea of God in Kabbalah, where God is mitzamtzem or does tzimtzum, where the massive presence of God shrinks itself so it fits into the human world. That again is the idea of putting God in the box. God says, shrink me. Shrink me, yes. Put me inside the ark. Put me inside the ark and put a cover over me so you can go about your business. Don't forget, I'm still present. But you don't always have to worry what I'm thinking and what I'm doing. Just go about your life. That is tzimtzum, the shrinking, the great shrinking of the divine presence. Humanity has to learn the same thing and allow others to dwell if you want to have sanctuary. And then there's bitocham. What does it mean to dwell amongst you? As we mentioned in weeks past, Moses did not dwell amongst the people. Moses moved out of the camp. He couldn't handle the humanity. Perhaps he was too God-enamored that he couldn't relate to humanity anymore, understandably. Okay, it was very complicated with Moses. We know that. With his wife, with his divorce, with his father-in-law. We talked all about Moses. But God says to the people, I want to dwell amongst you, right in the middle. And that is really what we have to talk about today. What does it mean to be amongst people? Well, this is part of the conversation we have about the homeless. Should the homeless be moved out of the park? Or do we allow the homeless to live amongst us? There's this NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Now, I'm not saying I'm advocating for one or the other, but when you're talking about being amongst you, we mean even if it bothers you, or even if it's too close. And then there's the exaggerated example I have to give you of politicians or leaders who say how much they care about their constituency and their constituents, and they care so deeply, and then they go on vacation when everyone else is being told to lock down. That, my friends, is not bitocham. You are not dwelling amongst us. You've created a sanctuary. You've created a leadership. You've said, I will be your resident leader. And then what do? You pick yourself up and you go to other warm climate destinations. With what? With what pretext? That your constituents are fine back home, they don't need you, or you can do everything by phone or video. If you're truly bitocham, if you're truly amongst them, you don't go on vacation when people in your state are dying. You just don't. Whatever the reason, you just don't. You can't. So it's a two-way covenant. Invite me in, make me your leader, but then I can't abscond with my authority. I can't leave and go on vacation. On the other hand, I also have to be invited in. But that is the deal. That's what's happening with politicians across North America, I'm sure around the world, but I don't know that much about it. But I know specifically in Canada and the United States, but there's so many people who have had such terrible lapses in judgment where they've gone off on vacation. And most recently, where literally people in the state are dying of cold and hunger, literally. Who would have thought that in a state like Texas, people would be burning their kitchen cabinets to keep warm? Who would have thought that people are actually without food, without shelter? It's incredible that somebody could get on a plane and go to Mexico. Doesn't matter why. That is not bitocham. They've made you the sanctuary. They've made you a leader. They've made you to dwell amongst them. And what do? You pick yourself up and you leave. So that, my friends, is why we're talking about v'shachanti bitocham, I will dwell amongst you, because with the leadership that you have and the obligation and the welcome of being invited to dwell within, you have an obligation to stay and dwell within. But this too is a message for everyone. We all have an obligation now to dwell within, to stay within. Please, I know we're all exhausted and tired. It has exhausted us to a point of breaking. But don't give in now. There is nobody out there that is fear-mongering for any reason other than the fact that they believe it to be true and they are afraid. I do not believe for 1 second that any of the medical officers of health have an agenda beyond their fear that this could actually explode. And I've heard it from doctors who are on the front lines who say the same thing. April will tell you what the future holds. March will be the beginning. By April, we'll know. And no amount of inoculation and vaccination will stop that wave. The two don't happen simultaneously. There will not be enough time to gain herd immunity. It's way behind. And yeah, the news on the vaccine front seems to be improving, but delivery is not just about what government does. Delivery is about what people do. I don't know if you read this terrible study in Israel, is that there were quite a few medical professionals, whether they be nurses, orderlies, or so on in hospitals, that had a chance to be vaccinated and chose not to be, for whatever their reasons were. And out of that group, a huge number of those have now contracted COVID. And I'm not here to talk about whether you should or should not vaccinate. I think absolutely you should. There's no question about it. But the point being is that humanity is the hardest thing to engage. In Bnei Brak, they're offering cholent if you come on Thursday night and get vaccinated. Other places, they're making big food buffets so you can come, well, not literally buffets, but they're giving away free food. If you come, you get vaccinated, you have some food. They're trying to make it into almost a celebration of vaccination because humanity is sluggish in that way. And we are the greatest risk to ourselves. And that's why v'shachanti betocham, we have to stay internally. We have to stay inside. We have to stay in our homes. Hopefully you have a mikdash, you have a sanctuary that you can go to. Maybe your home is your castle. Your home is your sanctuary, your family, your friends, whatever it is. If Netflix is your sanctuary, go there for the next little while. You cannot risk it at this point. And finally, we get to the story of Esther. Esther was the queen in the story of the Megillah, which we'll read later on this week. And Esther seizes her moment. Why is Esther the great heroine of the Bible, or hero? Why? The answer is because when she reached the moment where her needs were taken care of, she was the queen of Achashverosh. She had nothing to worry about. She was the queen. All she had to do was keep quiet. She would have survived. The Jewish people would have been wiped out. It didn't matter. The queen loved her, and it didn't make a difference. She didn't have to say anything, but she chose to. Because sometimes when you dwell amongst something, you're not dwelling in your own sanctuary. You're dwelling in someone else's sanctuary. And it's time to identify, my sanctuary is over there, not here. And she stepped out of her sanctuary that she could have lived in, and she chose to expose herself and save her people. And that is why she is one of the greatest women of the Bible and a role model for anyone who wants to know, when my moment comes, how will I know? The answer is, you'll know. You will know that this is your moment. Esther knew, Mordecai reminded her, and sure enough, she managed to save all her people with triumph. This is your moment to do something very simple, and that is stay in your sanctuary. I hope you all do. Shabbat Shalom.